and what was going on in your life that you kind of thought, I really should look into this, or started connecting the dots about ADHD?
Yeah. And I think those are two very different points for me, when it was like when I was diagnosed and then when I actually started figuring out what ADHD was. So I am the one that has the brother that meets all the markers. I mean, it was clear from the get-go. He was the hyper kid, and that's what everyone thought ADHD was. So I did not get even a little bit recognized as ADHD until somewhere in college, and I can't even pinpoint it. And it was a very not formal conversation. It was almost like, just go see your brother's psychiatrist for a second. She's willing to let you sit in the chair. And I remember it being a very brief conversation. And she was just like, here's some medicine. That I probably took a little bit on and off, didn't find it very helpful. And then we're in 2022. So somewhere in the last 3 years, really took the dive into looking into ADHD symptoms, because as a therapist, I was seeing stuff come up with kids that I was working with that just wasn't aligning with diagnoses. And then once I did the deep dive, it was just like, here I am, here are my kids. This is a whole new beast that I did not even understand. And I've been doing it for a long time.
And then looking back over your whole childhood with this new lens.
I mean, I just want to bang my head against the wall of like, why were my friends able to study and get it done in an hour? And I'm like all night long keeping these, note cards afresh. And why do I take a test and immediately forget the information? And y'all can recall the whole year's worth of what we studied, and every class for me is like brand new information. I mean, just the list goes on and on and on. Which is cool to look back and see all that stuff, but very frustrating thinking that could have been a lot easier.
Yeah. Oh, I know, right? I speak to so many women who did really well in school, and so it's always a part of the conversation, because I think there's also so many medical professionals who say you did well in school, so you can't possibly have ADHD. And then the question is then like, at what cost, right? Because like, I remember my first year of university, I did abysmally. I was partying all the time. I didn't go to any of my classes. I got a full F, and like, really it kind of, I understood finally in that environment what an F means, and like how it really like destroys your transcript moving forward. So I was like, I'm going to drop out. But then when I came back, I had to put everything I had, like all of my mental resources and emotional resources went into doing well in school. And I did well. I was on the dean's list. And, but like, it's funny because now I always talk about myself like I was this terrible student, and I kind of forgot about these periods of time when I was able to like really bring it all together to do well. And then I'm like, that's what all these other women were just doing all the time.
We were wearing ourselves out trying to meet the standards, and we were meeting it, but with a lot more effort than other people were having to do. And I think, and I don't know if this experience was for you, the more I kind of learned about this dopamine pattern and like these high days and these low days, I'm even able to look back at like years of high dopamine and like working in a very stressful environment where I was pretty much kept at this level, and then shifting out of that. A friend of mine actually was like, I think you're kind of detoxing from the however many years you did really stressful work, because you've like stepped down this year, and it feels like my unraveling has just peaked. I was like, I never thought about years of being kept at a level and then shifting when we make a shift in life.
Yeah, right. I mean, that is really interesting, because I talk about like working in a newsroom, right? And how much I loved being on deadline every night, and like, sitting at the edge of my seat, having to pee so badly, but like, wanting to get everything done, and the hyper focus and all of it, and then just leaving it all behind and starting fresh the next day. And I was like, now through this new lens, I realized like what an amazing job it was for, my interest driven brain and all of that, right? But I really what it was really difficult for me, I really crashed when I had a baby, because it was
Okay.
suddenly, I went back after my minuscule time off and I was sleep deprived, and like, and I've talked about this on the podcast too, like how I basically was told, if I, we were in this newsroom, so there's no, there's no offices or anything, it's just this one big floor of all of our desks, and I was told if I wanted to pump, I had to ask the editor in chief to vacate his office so that I could pump in his office, because it was literally the only like closable door. uh, so I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen on
Yeah, I'm not
deadline.
gonna do that.
Um, but it was like, for the first time in my adult life, I had been riding that high for so many years of this career I loved. And suddenly I was bad at that career. And
Yes.
I was also bad at being a mom. And it was like everything, I just
Who
felt bad
am
at
I?
everything. Right. Yeah. But it's, yeah, that it was almost like life burnout. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you just put into words my whole experience with that too, of coming back after being a mom. I think is the first triggering point where everything is kind of rattled off from there. But I've come back with a brain that doesn't make sense, with a functioning that doesn't make sense. I'm no longer meeting the level of performance that I was before, which probably wasn't very healthy in the first place, let's be real. But it's rattling because your whole self kind of functioning. And for me, my self-worth became in question because I don't know who this person is anymore that's not able to rise to the occasion and take it all on, despite, how exhausted I am in the process.
Right. And I think that's a level of grief that we don't talk about a lot. I deal with it with clients who are older, who've like gone through menopause and their life shifted tremendously through menopause. And that grief of like, not being able to do the things that we used to be able to do. And I think this is probably endemic of aging in general, but like I used to be an avid reader. Like I remember spending, hours and hours curled up in a chair reading books, and I just can't do that anymore. And so there's like a part of me that fought that, and I had the pile of books and I was like, I'm going to get to them. I know I am. And then I had to let that go and just be like, you know what? I listen to books now. and,
Yeah,
and, then, and
it is
that's
what it
right.
is.
It's just is what it is. And I had to let that go. But I think, in anything, grieving your past body and, grieve all the things that come with aging.
Yeah.
There is that sort of grief of like, I used to be good at technology. And now I look at my phone and I'm like, help. Yeah.
Yes, that realization is like, oh, I've shifted into that side of age where I don't know what they're talking about on technology. I don't know how to update the phone properly. I don't know what this thing's prompting me to do. The amount of Google searches on even how to run a simple Instagram page is mortifying.
I know, right? Yeah. So there's like that other level of not only the life that you could have lived, um, had you sort of had this perspective, but also just kind of realizing how have such a hard time with transitions. It makes sense that, I have a hard time, like I need a pep talk to take a shower, so no wonder it's really hard to like go through a huge hormonal shift in life. Or
Yeah. Yes. And I don't know about you, but now that I've seen what a big shift that was becoming a mom and the hormonal shift in that, I can look forward to menopause and I'm a little terrified of like, I mean, I feel like I got knocked down a little bit from becoming a mom. What's the next level that I'm about to hit?
yeah, right, yeah. I'm sort of half terrified, because I'm also sort of like, my memory is already shot. I don't know what's going to happen when I actually like, I'm in that, like, I'm turning 48 this year, so I'm in that like giant decade-long perimenopause question mark, where I'm like, is this normal, is this not, I don't know. But yeah, I'm also sort of like, it's already so bad, how much worse can it get? But then I also kind of feel like, well, maybe this is good, because I'm developing a grace with myself that will come in handy.
Yes, that grace. I was just thinking about it this morning. I think I'm one of those people, or it's part of ADHD where I have to be forced into a very humble position for me to give myself grace. Like, um, since my mom died, I don't think I would have ever stepped down as much as I've needed to like take care of myself and my family. Even though that was always kind of a long-term plan that I would probably shift down into like a part-time thing, I would have kept chugging right along and saying yes and taking on things and tried to keep status quo if something big in life didn't kind of knock me off course a little bit. And I don't know if that is a me thing or if that's a common ADHD thing where it's kind of like something has to knock us off a little bit to realize maybe we've been over functioning and doing all of that overachieving to justify our worth or our value. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's been really difficult for me to parse because I was diagnosed at the beginning of the pandemic. So like I always try to figure out, like, the pandemic brought so many boundaries in our lives. Like, they really forced us, brought out the introvert in so many of us. And now, right, like, and now we've had to kind of go back. And there's so many relationships that I had before the pandemic that I just don't have anymore, or certainly aren't as strong, or just feel odd and awkward and stilted in a way that I can't figure out and I can't really uncover. And so I think it was like this huge shift that in terms of boundaries, that we were just kind of chugging along and going at full steam and not really thinking about things. And now we've been forced to be really conscious about a lot of things that we're willing to accept, and a lot of us just aren't willing to accept that anymore. And so that's why it's like, God, everybody's quitting their jobs. Like,
Right.
right.
Your life shifts.
Yeah, and just being sort of feeling like, I don't know if it's ADHD, and if it's the diagnosis that has shifted in me a sense of like self-esteem, that I'm now not willing to be treated a certain way, and I'm not willing to I'm just not willing to like put myself in positions that I know will exhaust me, so I'm like, like the answer is almost always, like you said, to step back and pull back and minimize, right? I'm like, where can I minimize right now?
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's hard for those around us who don't understand too, because, they were used to us functioning at a certain level or always being the ones supposed to say, yes, I'll take it on. And all of a sudden we're kind of doing this pullback thing that I think is confusing and can be a difficult part of relationships.
Yeah, especially with RSD and rejection sensitive dysphoria, and sort of always feeling like putting yourself first always feels like it's at the expense of your relationships with other people, right? And so you carry with you that shame of like, if I look out for my own mental health, it's going to make things awkward for these people who are draining me.
Yes, yes. And I will preach that to my supervisees, to my people, to my colleagues all day long. It's okay to make a decision that is good for you and leaves others feeling disappointed or, in a difficult position. You're allowed to do that. But then when it comes time for me to do it, the RSD just swims. It's hard to do that.
It is, especially with I have a very complicated relationship with my father, and it's the same idea of like, at what cost, like if I sort of put my feelings last and I just am like, oh, just appease this old man and do what he wants, it feels so hard for me to, every decision feels hard, right? I'm like, if I respond and acquiesce, it feels terrible. If I ignore and reject, it feels terrible. Like, it just always feels like no decision feels right. And I'm always sort of like, what feels the least wrong in this moment? And then I'll deal with the next moment when it comes.
Right. Yeah, I can connect with that. Boundaries are a lot easier when I don't have to actively enforce them. And maybe that's not even a boundary if I don't have to actively enforce it. But I had a very complicated relationship with my mother before she died. And some of that time was me having to step away for several years and really kind of estrange myself at the advice of numerous therapists. I finally decided to listen. And that was almost easier for me. I mean, I needed to heal, I needed to work through a lot of stuff, but I didn't have to put all of this energy into enforcing a boundary that someone was constantly pushing. And then when we did kind of reunite a little bit, I had to hold up boundaries again. And I was like preemptively exhausted and anxious because I was like, man, I didn't have to think about that for a little bit. I just got to exist. And the boundaries are always, they're tough when we're naturally people pleasers, whether that's because of family dynamics or ADHD tendencies.
Yeah. I know. And you just made me think about how easy it is for me to be an open book with people I've never met before, but I feel instantly connected to. And yet at the same time, family, I'm just like, nope. I'm like walls everywhere.
everywhere. At this point, I'm not always sure if the wall should be there, but I'm just used to having it there, so it is.
Right. And there's so many people I've met in my life who would describe me as being very quiet and very guarded. And I'm like, no, that's just means I don't like you.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. And it's self-preservation there.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about grief. And you have, I mean, you faced your grief with your mom when your mom passed away. And I mean, we can say she took her own life, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, you spoke about it in such a public way. You brought that on, and I really commend you, because it's tremendously uncomfortable to be in and also to watch, right? And I think one of the things, my mother passed away 5 years ago, and I think one thing that struck me, we had a complicated relationship too, but I was like, it was so lonely. Grief is so lonely. And I remember thinking, like, it's something we all go through. It's a universal experience to lose somebody who is close to you. Why does it feel like nobody understands what you are going through? And every interaction, also, like I said before, like every interaction feels wrong and unsatisfying. And I just really wanted to thank you for like going through that in such a public but also uncomfortable way, because I think we all, like certainly learned a lot about kind of grief and how much grief comes with that like self-isolation and the shame, and it really doesn't need to.
Yeah. Um, Grief is a beast. I don't know that I'll ever wrap my brain around, and definitely I don't think ever truly experienced until this. I think this was the first loss that really hit me emotionally. Not to say I haven't cared about other people that have passed, but this one hit me. And it's really interesting. I never intended to process it publicly or to not process it publicly. And I think in a very ADHD fashion, when something hit me and my brain kind of paired it with a song or paired it with something, I just did it as my own way of processing. And I think I'm finding that my page is a place where I can do a lot of creative things without even realizing that's what I'm doing. But the amount of comments that I had, especially on that post where I'm silently screaming, comments or messages of like, I've been on the verge, but seeing what it would actually do to my children, seeing like what it is that's happening with you takes that off the table for me. Or I just never considered putting that kind of stuff out there would be helpful for someone who was struggling with ideas of suicide. But that was a really interesting thing to see. So yeah, it's bizarre. I would love to say that I put all this thought and intentionality between me putting this stuff out there, but it really was just me kind of greeting in the best way I knew how, and going, there are people that probably connect with it. There may be a lot of trolls that tell me, what are you doing? That's too public. Yeah, it's weird.
It is.
It just is.
I feel that way sometimes about this podcast. I never know what to say when people thank me for making the podcast, because I'm like, it's so selfish to be like, it's really, I don't go into any conversation being like, this is going to help people. Like, I never wanted to, I never started a podcast that was like, here's everything you're going to learn about blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And so like the intention is not there for me to like worry about whether I'm serving others. Like for me, it's just so fun. And so, it's purely selfish. And so I'm always sort of like, when people are like, thank you for having this, thank you for doing this, I'm like, you're welcome. Like, and so I guess that is sort of the nice side about diving headfirst, right, into I don't want to call it impulsivity, but it's almost like we don't have the patience to really think about what we're doing in a way that I really appreciate. Like I remember talking to a friend of mine who was house hunting, and she was talking about how many houses she and her husband went to. They went to like 18 houses, and they had a pros and cons list. And I was like, that would never work for me. I was like, my husband and I, thankfully he was the same. We like went to the first house and we were like, I like the vibe here. We'll take it.
Yes, that's so funny that you talked about house hunting in that way. My husband and I have been that way too. Like sometimes you aren't even looking for a house, and we were like playing around online and found one and just walked up on it. And we're like, oh, yeah, I think we're gonna move. We're gonna do this.
I know, right? And I had so many instances too where I was like, I moved into an apartment, and then only after I moved in did I realize that there were like no three-pronged outlets anywhere. And I was like, oh crap, yeah, I should have looked into that. Oh.
That detail.
But it's that kind of like just dive head first. It's not impulsivity. What's the word? Is compulsivity? I don't know.
It's
Failure to plan.
Living in the now. I mean, we live in the now. So, I will record like 4 reels in a day with a plan to like hold them and like parse them out. And by midnight that night, they've all been posted because the ideas hit me, the motivations hit me, the energies hit me, and we're going to act on it now.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That was one of your reels that really blew my mind when, you're talking, you're exploring the theme of big feelings, right?
Yeah.
And how you had a reel where you said, remember that current moments don't always represent all moments. And that was the first time I really associated time blindness, right? Because that's really what it is, that different that, we have a now and a not now mentality when it comes to time, and how like time blindness was intrinsically linked to our emotions and emotional dysregulation, and I see it in my kids all the time now, like my son who just goes from 0 to 150% overwhelmed immediately because we see everything, we see all the outcomes all at once. Right. And so our cup just jostles and gets overflows, and how it never occurred to me that is really kind of related to time blindness.
I know, it was wild when that kind of clicked in my brain. I was like, oh, this urgency, this agitation, this low frustration tolerance, this quick to a feeling comes from everything either being felt now and overwhelming me in that moment, or my brain going, well, this is how it's always been. You've always felt this way, or you've always struggled with this, or you will always, XYZ. That can be really overwhelming.
Right. And yeah, especially with like, fights with my husband, right? Where it's like, you go from those, like something really tiny, it becomes something enormous because you see how it relates to all of these other things, and there's it spirals so quickly. Right. Because you're sort of like, I know how this is going to end. I know how this conversation is going to go, and it's going to be, and so you've already written the whole conversation before it even began.
Right. Fortunately, at its finest.
Right. Yeah. But I think we have a tendency to do that in relationships sometimes, which is like, I already had this conversation by myself. I didn't need you.
Oh, probably 100 times by myself. Let's be real. Over and over and over and over and over. Yeah, I'll catch myself. My husband's great about it. I'll start using the always words. I always kind of, we always sort of, we never really. And he's like, I don't think that's a fair thing to say. Like literally 3 days ago, we did this, which contradicts what you're saying. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. This is just a moment. He's like, yeah, Candin, it's just a moment. Let's not make it about everything. Okay, you're right.
Yeah, that is a great kind of flag to remember in terms of like, am I using these words right now? It reminds me of like personality tests or any kind of test where there's like a scale of 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, where it's like, definitely disagree and like or strongly disagree and strongly agree. And I'm like, I'm one or the other. I'm never in the middle.
There's never a middle point. Why do we even have a middle? What's the point of that? Who is sitting right there? Doesn't everyone have the strong one way or the other feeling?
Yeah, and I think that's also kind of why I think we spend a lot of time questioning, like, how much am I struggling right now, right? Like that does, I think that's something that's common with a lot of us, which is like having a really hard time feeling like, like if a doctor says like, how much pain are you in on the pain scale, right? Where you're like, I don't know, like
always there's some, so
it could be worse. So like, I'm always have a tendency to be like, I don't know, a 2. And then they're like, well, why did you come in today? If your pain's at a 2. And I'm like, oh, okay, fine, maybe 3. Like, but having, feeling so disconnected from our own sense of pain and struggle, and that idea that like we can't really trust how we interpret our own emotions, because maybe it's because we sort of have that tendency to live in the extreme. I don't know, I'm just thinking off the fly.
Well, even you saying that, my brain just kind of had a flash over what we just talked about of we struggle so much and things can be really difficult for us all the time that maybe we get so used to that we don't stop to realize this is too much. We've passed the threshold of acceptable like struggle or pain so that we can slow down and prevent that burnout. We don't have a good radar because things are just hard. So more hard, just doesn't really resonate, that we should take care of ourselves or pause or step back because I don't know, it's always hard. So how do I know this is too much or that I should stop or take a break?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of hit me then.
Right. Yeah. Because I definitely talk a lot about that idea that we have to be at our wits' end before we welcome help. Right. And like, where's that coming from? Is that just how we were raised in our Protestant work ethic, that like self-reliance is a virtue? So we as women, like we have to always we need to seek permission to ask for help. And usually that permission is like, I can't function, or, but even just the littlest things, like it drives me crazy when I have a client who's talking about like getting a housekeeper and they're like, I got a housekeeper and we had all this back and forth, but I felt like I really needed it because I have a dog and a cat and I was like, you don't have to justify any of that.
It's okay to just get help.
Right. But all the ways in which we have to kind of explain how we got to this point of asking for help in a way that feels like we finally have permission. And I'm like, you don't need permission to have help.
Right. And I agree. I don't know. Teasing that out, I've gotten a lot of messages of like ADHD versus trauma or their combination, or, are you someone who covers up your stuff with white lies? That's only because your parents weren't supportive. But I see across the board that some of us come from very supportive families, but still have a hard time asking for help and still acknowledging that we need something without being absolutely burnt out and not functioning. So I've got to assume it's connected to the actual diagnosis and not always the environment, because it's just such a common thing that we see, whether your background is traumatic and hard or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about that a lot when it comes to my kids and like pushing them to do things, right? Because I felt like my parents didn't push me enough, that they were very much sort of like, oh, you're just the kid who does poorly in school, right? My story was always like, you have the highest IQ of all of our kids, because we all had to get tested to be in the gifted program. So I don't know what it was, but like they had it on file somewhere. So my story to them was like, isn't it funny that you have the highest IQ of all three of our kids, but you do terribly in school?
Right.
And they would be like, but that's okay. You don't have to do well in school. You've got street smarts and you're good at other things. Like, we don't care if you're good at school. But like now as an adult, I realized how damaging that was. Just in terms of like, I kind of needed, obviously I needed help in terms of like wanting to, like, I wanted so badly to succeed. And so I see that in my own kids where I'm sort of like, I want them to do well, because I know how good they will feel about themselves if they are pushed to do well. And I used to coach Girls on the Run, which is this running program for, I don't know if you've heard of it, right? But the whole concept of Girls on the Run is like, we don't care how you finish the 5K. So basically you train for a 5K. Many of these girls, they're young, they're in grades 3 through 6. So it's like, they've never done anything close to a 5K. They're terrified. And we go through this program where we talk about social and emotional development, but we also just like practice, and eventually they get past the finish line. And the emphasis is never on how fast you go. We're like, you can walk, you can run, we don't care, but you have to cross the finish line, because that feeling of completion is so wonderful that we want you to have that. And so on the one hand, I know that like being pushed to do things can be really rewarding. But on the other hand, through this lens of ADHD, I also know that like consistency is overrated. And right. And then there's like, I don't know if I'm just like driving a wedge between my kids if I'm pushing them in a way that they don't want to be pushed, right? Like I don't know, I find I get very confused by I mean, obviously, because I'm a parent, I get confused by everything in terms of like, am I screwing them up? How much of this is is like lasting damage? But I'm like, I feel like I often get confused over like, what is the best way to encourage and push my children
Yeah.
versus like just letting them
Be.
kind of be right and not finish things because
Right.
who really cares? And at the end of the day, I don't care if they get all A's, but I know how they'll feel if they get them.
Right.
And
Right. Oh gosh, I resonate with all that. And it's good to hear you talk about like the approach that your parents had, probably very intentionally trying to make you feel okay about the way you were functioning. But looking back, you're like, oh, I needed the push. And that probably would have been my approach too with my son. Like once he gets into school, we're okay with if you're a C student or if you're an A student or whatever. But now my brain just twitched and goes, well, maybe that's not the approach I should take. I don't know. Yeah, because the balance is hard. Like, okay, so do we raise a kid who finishes baseball because they signed up and we're not quitters, we're going to finish it? Or do I recognize your ADHD means that your dopamine dropped off 3 months ago and this is absolutely miserable for you and it's okay to stop and have just start the journey of your probably 1,500 hobbies that you're going to do over your life, like
without shame. Yeah. Right.
So,
I know.
what are we
And
doing here?
I had an experience with my 15-year-old because she's in ninth grade. She just started high school. She's one of those kids who always did really, really well and was always able to kind of keep her own structure. But I mean, she just did her homework on her lunch break and in the bus. Like it's not like she ever did homework. And so now she's in high school and she's falling behind, in some of the classes that have a lot more requirements. And so I had that instance where I was like, all right, well, this is what I needed from my parents was like more intervention. So I'm going to be on top of it. I'm going to be talking to her every night. We're going to go over her homework. It's going to be structure out the wazoo. And then she started lying to me for the first time ever, where I was like, do you have homework? And she was like, no, I'm good. Or she lied and said, I did it already. And she hadn't. And then she got busted because I was like, this doesn't sound right. Let me see it. And she got busted. And then I was like, well, this isn't what I want,
Right. Pressure where you have to lie about stuff now.
That's what I did with my parent. They asked me if I had homework and I said, yeah, I did it. And I was totally lying. So suddenly I was sort of like, okay, well, that backfired. And I sat down with her and was like, what do you need? Like, how are we going to succeed? And, cause I'm like, I don't want to get in a situation where you're just going to lie to me because you're not doing what you sort of feel like you should be doing. Like, but at the same time, like, what's the best way to help you? And she's 15. So she was like, I don't know.
Are you supposed to know that? The whole point of this whole parent-child thing?
Who put me in charge? But we both kind of had that feeling of like, we don't know what the best thing to do right now is, but we're going to work on it together. And that's where I sort of felt like, okay, this was like a parenting win. Anytime I'm just like super honest and vulnerable with my kids is when I feel like it's a parenting win, where
right.
It's like, we just
want collaborating, including them in it, not just, well, initially going in with like, thinking we've got all the answers and then sitting down and going, okay, because that didn't work. Either what do you need or like for you, what is success? For me, I'm assuming you feel successful if you get an A in this class. Is that even your thinking behind success or is it something else? Yeah.
I know, right? Kids.
I know.
I want to backtrack a little bit back to talking about feelings, because I know you have a new course that you're offering about ADHD feelings, and I want to find out what's involved in that. But you had a really interesting reel too. First of all, I love your reels. I know I said this before, but like every time you have such great taste in music that like I will listen to your reel and then just go back and be like, I need to add that to my playlist. Like you basically have curated my playlist because I'm like reminded of all these songs that I love and they just hit different when you're playing them. So I just wanted to thank you for that. Compliment you on your music taste. But
I've had people be like, we want to hear you talk more. I'm like, yeah, I know, but half of my motivation comes from when I hear a song and then my topic goes with that song and that's what does it. So sorry guys, there's going to be a lot more of me pointing and smiling with music because that's what my brain does.
Right. And I have that relationship with music too, which is like, I will become obsessed with a song and I'll just play it on repeat. And so I'm obsessed with Liability by Lord. I don't know if you play like, oh my God, it's so good. Like it's there's, what is that word of just like wanting to kind of get to an emotional place, even if I'm just kind of like, I'm going along and then I'm like, I want to be really sad right now, so I'm going to listen to this song to
Yes,
experience that sadness. I'm like, what's that about?
yes, but I will use that because, you know, yes, we've got the big feelings, but we also have this piece of us that can go on autopilot and just grind through our days and our weeks without ever like touching base with the feeling until it, overwhelms us in a processing moment. And so I've gotten to where now where I can feel this restlessness or physical sensation that I can't put a name to. I usually go, it's time for me to listen to one of these songs and see if it puts me in that spot. Inevitably, it'll put me into this tearful moment and I'll start having clarity of my feelings. It's like, okay, I need to remember to use that as my emotion regulation technique. Like,
Right?
I'll put myself there and actually feel the feeling that I probably stuffed or ignored or just busied myself over.
Yeah, it is so powerful. I love thinking about music. And that was the other thing that's different. Sometimes I will hear a song like 20 times, but I haven't listened to the lyrics. I really like I really like just the music, right? And it was actually, that was an example, that song Liability. My 10-year-old son started singing the music and he was like, I love what this song is about. And I was like, huh, I've never listened to the lyric. And so then I had to listen to the lyrics and was like, oh. And I
Yes,
think, I think it comes from like having a childhood where you would buy the tape or the CD and you would pull out the liner notes and you would like
yes,
go through the whole thing and read all the lyrics and just be
yes.
like this otherworldly experience. And like, we don't get that anymore now.
No, no, I'm just mumbling along to what I think is a lyric, but just like really vibing off of the actual music piece until I learn the words later.
Right. I know. I'm
Yeah.
always get my daughter always, she's the same way. It was like she'll listen to the music and she has to like be really intentional to listen to the lyrics. Whereas my husband, he like immediately knows what the song is about and he'll listen to the lyrics right away the first time he hears a song. And I'm like, is that a neurodivergent thing? Like just having to
Right.
like listen in one way or listen in another way. Like you have to like
Yeah.
choose before the song starts how you're going to listen to it.
Yeah. Oh man, that's funny.
Um, so you had a reel recently about the difference between masking and emotional regulation, which I found really interesting, but I'm still confused by. Like I was like, oh, that makes total sense. And then I come away from it and I'm like, I would not be able to describe what the difference is. So can you go over that for me again for the kids in the back of the
Yeah.
room?
And my brain immediately goes, I need to pull that up and see what it is. um, and I can remember what triggered, well, I can almost remember it. I did some reel beforehand, and people were like, you're talking about masking, you're talking about, oh, I think I talked about the intensity of emotions. And I was
It was like
explaining
coming
that we feel
down from.
emotions, yeah, more intensely. And they were like, well, that's okay. You shouldn't have to stop the intensity. You're talking about masking. And it's like, well, I'm not talking about masking. It's okay that we have big emotions, but we also are responsible for being aware of the situation we're in and recognizing not just that our intensity is matching the event, but like what consequences are going to come either in my relationships or my work or what I'm doing if I'm reacting off of my initial 100 intensity that we always get to. So even with people that I work with, like you can be ecstatic. I don't care if your intensity of joy and happiness is at 100 all the time, because that's likely not causing a lot of harm. But we still have a need to just be mindful of if I react to the intensity of 100 over traffic, because me and road rage are really good friends. That's not really good for me to like blow my horn at people and be flipping them off and like riding their tail because they didn't go fast enough on green. Now, me telling you to manage that, or me telling myself to manage that 100 reaction and not react at 100, is not masking, it's emotion regulation. Okay, traffic is not something I should be responding to at 100% intensity. Maybe I should do some things to help bring myself down so I'm not road raging everywhere. That makes sense. I don't know. That was a very roundabout way.
No, that's a great example. Yeah, because I feel like it's like know your triggers, right? So and I've been fascinated. I've been thinking a lot about kind of the way in which we're all diagnosed with depression and kind of how we get to that diagnosis. Because for me, I feel like a lot of my depression came from feeling like I was hurting the people around me, either
Yeah.
through my emotional dysregulation or, feeling like I was making poor decisions, or just like I was just like a trash human. And in reaction or in relation to other people. And
Yeah.
so and feeling like I was broken, and also feeling like I can't control a lot of my behaviors, and specifically around like my kids and rage, right? Like that
Yeah.
was because I had, a lot of emotional dysregulation when I had a baby. And that kind of hurt, my husband, because I'm like, he's helping, he's doing all these wonderful things, and I'm just yelling at everybody, what's wrong with me? I should go
Right.
on antidepressants, right? And so it's now I'm looking at it through this new lens of like having sensory issues and sleep
Yes.
deprivation and all the other kind of things that I never thought about when I was postpartum. And now it's like I realize it's much easier for me to know what my triggers are, so I don't get to that rage point, right? So I'm
Right.
like, oh, the reason why I was feeling out of control in my rage was because I wasn't paying attention to the fact that the TV was on, and that this was happening, and I was trying to make a recipe and do all these things, and like that's why I was being thrown into a rage. So
Right.
I often talk about like having the notes in the margin, right? Where I'm like, just knowing the why behind a lot of our behaviors helps us to kind of not get to the boiling point a lot of the time, because we can kind of
Right.
see where it's like, I know where this is headed. I know how this ends. How can I
Yeah.
pivot? How can I pull back?
Right.
Right. I think the answer is almost always, how do I pull back in everything
Always.
in my life, right? I'm like
How do I pull
burnout,
back? How do I
right?
pause?
It's
That's a
like,
hard shift if that's not the momentum your life had before. If it was always pushing forward and moving forward and faster and taking it on, reversing and pulling back and actually being mindful of what your triggers are and what it does to you emotionally and physically and how it affects your relationships or this or that, or your parenting. That can be a really hard shift.
yeah. And also, this idea of just kind of, shit, I lost my train of thought. This idea of like, because it was reminding me of again, that like failure to pause that like leads you to buy the house and do all these things. And I'm
Yes.
like, so there's like a positive side to all of that. But I think also like, um, it's, God, I don't know why I keep losing this thought about something about pulling back. Oh, I know what it was. Sort of going back to this idea of depression diagnoses, right? Because I
Yeah.
feel like depression, I'm curious what your point of view is on like depression. For me feels like a lack of desire, like you've given up, right? That there's a
Right.
sense of inevitability or something, like you've just
Right.
given up. And I think for a lot of us, the lack of desire, we have the opposite issue. We have so much desire, we
So
want to
much.
do all the things, we want to keep going at 100%, as Energizer Bunny, and we have all these ideas of businesses and stuff that we want to do, and we just can't do those things
Right.
because we don't know how, or we've got the executive dysfunction, we can't bring ourselves, I mean, all the reasons why we are overwhelmed by our own ambitions and our own
Yes.
desires, which feels often to me the opposite of depression.
Oh, yes. I agree. I mean, the amount of ideas that I've had for Humanity Hive in the last, I mean, we're just not hitting almost a year mark of it being up. It's just ridiculous the amount of things I've talked about or thought about doing and have barely scratched the surface on one, because even just the first step at figuring out how to set up the website for it or the basics of Calendly, good Lord, all those kind of things can get in the way and then trigger that RSD of maybe I'm not capable. Maybe I'm not the person to do this. This isn't the path I should take. It shouldn't be this hard, so forth and so on. But the pause can really help for so many things. I mean, it can help us realize what we would have acted on impulsively that maybe wasn't really true to our values. It was coming from an outside expectation or an outside energy that wasn't really ours. Just gives you a second for your nervous system sometimes to calm down so that you don't cut somebody out when they say something that's upsetting. You can actually have a response that's helpful and productive. yeah, that pause is powerful, but it is hard to wrangle in sometimes.
Yeah. Do you, I know, I like the idea of, how has my language changed, with the idea of like, am I using terms like always or,
Yes.
right? Like, what are some other ways that you can kind of train yourself to know when it's time to pull back, besides like exhaustion and burnout?
I think when I realize that I'm going, for me, if I'm going into like defensive or fight mode, and for me, the common word would probably be mama bear, because I would probably most commonly go there with my son. But if I can feel my initial reaction is like to justify more than I should or be defensive or something like that, that's my sign to like take a breath, human. Your defensiveness or your desire to go on the attack and a response is usually because you feel insecure or anxiety or fear about something. So you need to just give it a minute. And usually when I do, my response is much less intense. I go from 100 to 20. And once I get down to that 20 level of intensity, that still feels true to me. That still feels authentic. But it's articulated in a way that I would actually want to communicate it versus just being like,
yeah, I feel that way sometimes about the emotion of frustration, right? Because I'm sort of like, when I'm frustrated, I have to stop and be like, is this something I even want? Because, right, because we're so interest driven that often I think we get these ideas in our head, like we should be the kind of person who does X, right? And because we can't, we get really frustrated with ourselves. And so I'm like, even just the emotion of frustration is a time for me to be like, stop and be like, is this something I really like authentically need to do and want to do? Or is this, have I just gotten wrapped up with the idea that like, I want to create, this wonderful conferences or or all the things that I want to do with my business, where I'm like, okay, like let's just take a step back.
Right. Is that because I want to do those things, or it's somewhere in my brain telling me my business isn't successful unless I do that thing? Or
oh yeah, don't even get me started on growth, right? Because I'm like, or just the idea that like consistency is akin to failure in my mind, right? Like I think about that with like my podcast downloads each week. I'm like, if they have to rise, if they don't rise, if they stay stagnant, that is basically failure to me.
That's failure. Oh, 100%, 100%. And let me tell you, the day I actually was on my page and saw my follower count drop in front of my eyes, I was like, oh my gosh, we didn't just maintain, we dropped. But yeah, if it's not growth, if it's not constantly growing, yeah, that's failure in my brain.
I know, right? And then I'm like, I wonder why I'm so burnt out all the time.
Right. Geez, I wonder where this comes from, this desire to always be going.
I had to, right? I had to like really emotionally distance myself from follower count because it was getting to that point where I was thinking about like the next goalpost and getting so excited. And then, and I don't mean to sound like an asshole, but like, people are always thanking the follower count when they get to a certain milestone. They're like, thank you so much. And I had to distance myself from that meaning anything to me, because I really had to be like, if I make it all about that, then I'm going to get really frustrated and burnt out and all of these other negative emotions. So I had to distance myself from it. And then there was a part of me that's like, am I ungrateful because I'm not thanking people every time I get to a next milestone? And I was like, I can't even deal with that question, because for me, like, I know that if I pay attention to that, it's going to be bad.
Yeah. And I can notice my anxiety and my RSD worse if I'm paying attention to those markers, instead of just, am I putting something out there that's helpful, or period? Am I putting something out there that's helpful versus is it growth? Yeah. And usually it's for me. Half the time, y'all, when I'm putting out there, like, y'all are getting a peek into what you get struggling with. So yeah, it's the value then shifts if I pay attention to that too much, and that's where we get to that burnout stuff really easily.
I know, right? Yeah, I think at this point I basically like, does this make me laugh?
Yeah. Yes.
Right? And even if nobody else is laughing, I'm laughing, and that's
right.
Really all
I think
it's
hilarious.
Right? Okay, so the ADHD feelings course, there's that one, and then there's another one, right? You have the diagnosis or the overview, right?
The overview. And they were probably a very healing focused thing, so I put it out pretty quickly after my mom died. But yeah, so they're very casual in nature. It would look like you're kind of sitting with me if you were in my office as a client. And the feelings course, I really like because it's really narrowed down interventions that I believe in, because either I use them myself, or when I have introduced them to clients, these are the ones that most of the people are responding to, like, oh no, that made a difference. That really helped with that thought I couldn't stop ruminating on, or that feeling and understanding. So that one is really just several very brief interventions kind of compiled together, especially for those people that I keep seeing that they can't get into a therapist, they can't access help, or they can't, what do I do in the meantime? I said, well, here's like 6 or 7 things that have been helpful for me and other people. Maybe they can help bridge that kind of gap for those that are waiting to get regular help. And that overview is not a complicated one. It's one that, those of us that are in this ADHD world, we're seeing it a lot, interest-based nervous system, hyperarousal of feeling and thoughts, and then rejection sensitivity. But I realized I was never taught those. And most of the people that are on my page or even coming to see me in person, if they were even diagnosed years ago, they were never educated on that either. So it was like, well, let me put this all in one spot, because y'all tell me that y'all don't want to read the articles. It's too much to go search for your own. I get all that. So here's a video of me talking about it to help you out.
Oh God, I love that. And I wish I had the time to do that. Because it's true. Like, I get the frustration of not wanting, of being on this journey and having this diagnosis and just being so overwhelmed and really wanting to like be held. Right. But I also really get frustrated when I put all of this content out there and then somebody DMs me and says like, hey, what do you suggest I do? And I'm like, I don't know, go to my fucking link tree, right? Like,
like all those links. And then I was telling my husband, like, I love and laugh the population that I'm working with, because I have their brain, but also I'll get that impulsive question and I go, oh, just go look.
I know,
but
right?
I'll always do the same thing. So let me be patient and kind of do that whole self-awareness cycle.
I know it is really difficult, because that's, again, it's like, I can't drop everything and help every single person who DMs me. And so I'm sort of, I want to have that patience, but there's a huge part of me that's like, just fucking Google it like the rest of us did.
Even though I'm here to help you not have to do that, sometimes I just need you to go do that.
And I've interviewed a few women at this point who are kind of involved with, or even have founded these like ADHD centers.
Yeah.
Which I really love the concept of, right? It's almost like this like one-stop shop where you can go and like you can get your diagnosis, you can have speech pathologists and therapists and sort of all working together, which I love, because that's one of the things I think so many of us experience, which is just the overwhelm of like, who do I talk to? Who diagnoses? Like, where do I even start? And I really love that. I hope that becomes more popular as understanding grows in terms of like all the different tools in your toolbox that you can kind of bring in, but how much we need our hands held, right?
Yes, and how I can simultaneously get frustrated by it, even though I am one of those people who needs my handheld. The contradictions of us, but gosh, those centers are amazing, and I realize more and more as followers reach out how many in Europe and in other countries, they're on waiting lists for years, and my brain can't even for me here, months is a long time, and some places are maybe a year, but people are like, yeah, I'm on the wait list to get assessed, but that's 3 years from now. What am I supposed to do? And it kind of eye opens for me, at least that's something. I guess in the US we are aware of the ADHD, in some worlds, in some countries think we overdiagnose it, but just the lack of resources in so many other places in the world.
I know, right? And I often grapple with that too, because I'm sort of like, a self-diagnosis is so important, right? So even if you're awaiting a diagnosis, like there's so much work you can do in terms of your own treatment plan that doesn't involve a formal diagnosis, doesn't even involve medication. But I think, and I don't think we should put the emphasis on and pathologize ADHD in that way. But I also think that like, it's really validating to
Really
get
is.
that, right? Like, and I often will say, like, I wish I had like a AAA card or something that reminds me that somebody else diagnosed me, because even though this is my entire life and I talk about it all the time and I have a podcast, like there's still that voice that's like, yeah, you're just making it up. You're really,
You're just lazy,
right?
victim.
And so, yeah, to imagine having to wait on a years long waiting list and to feel like you can't get started until you've got that one ingredient, and
Right. Yeah, imagine experiencing that and then living in the now. I mean,
right, or somebody giving you a manual but being like chapter 3 got ripped out, and right, and you can't
right.
be like, well, I can't read anything else until I have the whole exhausted textbook.
Yes, absolutely.
So now, are you still working with other therapists? Because the last time we spoke, you were kind of helping and training and doing courses.
Yeah.
You're still doing that?
Um, I am, but much more steps back.
It's like one of the 18,000 things you're working on right now.
Yes. And it's one of, I've stepped back definitely from after my mom killed herself. I found out in my office at work. I got the phone call right after doing a therapy session. So I've realized that the building triggers me a whole lot. And so even being there, it immediately brings back that whole process. So definitely working through caring for myself and recognizing I had to hand off a lot of clients because I'm not in a position to walk a trauma journey with you right now while I'm sitting in my own. And so I'm still doing a little bit of the diagnosing and assessment. I've got a very, very small caseload of people that I see. But I think that continues to kind of shift down as I look more into just doing a supervision type thing with other therapists and trainings and really putting effort into community hive and just kind of seeing where it goes. But recognizing my desire to stay as busy and in that therapist chair is not where I need to be for a little while because grief is just a bitch.
Yeah. Oh, I hear you. Well, I mean, I really appreciate your living out loud in this way and kind of living in the moment and being vulnerable. I know it's helping so many people. And even though that kind of is like an added bonus, right?
Yeah, it helps me too.
I think if our motivation was to help people, I'd probably like be so mired in anxiety and worry if I was like serving them properly that I would step over myself. Like I feel like it has to be this other way of like, what's most interesting to me right now.
Right.
But I do really appreciate what you're doing, and I just adore your content and